Hi, this is your host Lolita Cros, and you're watching Eye to Eye, a conversation between two artists where they discuss their work, their inspirations, and ongoing projects. In today's episode, we go to Brooklyn to photographer Roe Etheridge's studio, whom I've set up on a studio date with fellow photographer Tina Barney. Roe Etheridge's photographs blur the lines between humor and austerity, as well as commercial and fine art. Regarded as one of the most important figures of new photography, Etheridge's career began in the early 2000s. Recognized as a master of the large format, Tina Barney established herself at MoMA's historical 1983 Big Picture show. She portrays fading rituals and American traditions by appropriating the codes of Dutch and Italian Renaissance painting. What do a Gen X and a baby boomer have in common? More than you might think. Together, we discussed their unorthodox beginnings, their relationships with commercial and fine art photography, and the influence past generations may have had on their current work. Roe and Tina, thank you so much for being part of the new Eye to Eye episode. You both bridge a gap between commercial, editorial, fine art photography in a way that's pretty unusual. So my first question to you guys is, how did you get started? Did you start with editorial work and to then get into fine art photography, or was it the opposite way around? What's your relationship with both of those worlds? Tina, do you want to start?
I got started because a young man called Michael Collins was the picture editor of the London Daily Telegraph magazine. I think it was in the 90s, and he started using fine art photographers. The first job he sent me on was to go to Atlanta, Georgia, and photograph something called the Scarlet Society. It was a club for men to meet women. And he said one thing to me. He said, "Tina, pretend you're in Papua New Guinea." And that was like one key thing, and I just got it. It was weirder than you can imagine. And then he started hiring Larry Sultan and other people. And then it blended in to Dennis Friedman. I don't know if you ever met him.
Yes, of course.
Which was one of the great experiences I've ever had, was working for W Magazine. Mm-hmm. And the jobs he sent us on were so spectacular. We could do whatever we wanted.
So they knew of your work in fine art photography and then kind of cast you for that as a photographer. Mm-hmm. Ro, what was your in on that?
You know, as a kid, my dad was, this would have been in the 70s, he was a real avid like amateur photographer and like would do those kind of pictures that you see in like photo magazines, like very classic 70s photography things. I guess I was constantly in the picture. In high school, it seemed like, yeah, this is really something I could do. I went to Florida State. I was able to take those, you know, art elective photography classes, and then pretty soon it was clear, like, I'm not going to be any, you know, humanities major. I'm better off being an artist. So then I dropped out of university and started going to Atlanta College of Art. And my parents were still living in suburban Atlanta at that time. I knew that I really was into Andy Warhol and New York and all of that stuff. You know, I had like sort of studied them in a very innocent kind of way, but Lee Friedlander was my guy. I knew that much.
Well, that's pretty sophisticated.
Looking back at it, I'm like, you know, I think I just saw that both of them were so droll and funny and compositional in a sort of flat way. And so commercial photography seemed like a natural sort of hybrid of those things. And in Atlanta, they don't have, I mean, unless you come to do an editorial, there's nothing going on. So, except catalog photography. So I started assisting catalog photographers.
That's where it's all began. Yeah, that's
so it's
terrific.
like, and that's where it started to things started to make sense. Where it was like, oh, I am both the consumer of this stuff, you know, through the JCPenney's and Sears catalogs that we had at the house.
Very interesting.
And now I'm like, you know, assisting photographers making these generic images, and like I think at that point, like everything started to sort of make sense.
So we're talking about what years are we talking about?
That would have been in the 80s.
And so that's really an interesting sort of influence. So I have something similar. My mother was a fashion model in the 30s.
Oh, is that right?
But her father was an amateur photographer and had his own darkroom. And he used to drag me down there to look, and I didn't want to. And you think, okay, that has to have influenced me. And he kept photographing us, too.
So there you go. You're like you already were like being trained how to work in that field, you know.
I don't know.
But can you talk about that assignment that you got and how you came to accept it as maybe something part of your own inventory, right? Exactly.
Because inventory is more like what happens at the Gap or JCPenney's, and like I don't want to be like, it's an archive. You know what I'm saying? Like it's so serious. But in this case, it was this was a beauty story for Allure magazine.
Oh, sure.
I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing. I asked the guys at PhotoCare, like, I'm doing a beauty story. Like, what should I do?
Her kind of, not dopey look, but her expression and her big eyelashes and her big lips. I love it.
The assignment was how to put on lipstick. It was my first assignment for doing this kind of beauty work. And when Kasmin showed up, her lips were really, really chapped. And I was like, oh no, you know, what am I supposed to do? I was so overwhelmed. I used to say like these like jobs would take years off my life. You know, it was like every day I worked was the one less day that I lived. You know what I mean? It was
I'm
so
glad you
stressful.
think that. That makes me feel so much better.
So anyway, that was like one of those scenarios where it was like, I know I'm not a professional beauty photographer, but I can like take this picture of this girl and we can do it together. You know, in my mind there was a circuit, and I think that I can relate to that in your work, where there's like, I'm not giving you a script, but you know, we are collaborating and it's going to be my name on it. And so I had this like Polaroid on my, you know, studio desk, and then all my like conceptual photography stuff over here. You know, Ron Jude, my friend, came over to look at my work, and he was like, but what's this one? And I was like,
that's interesting.
I was like, yeah, I know. It's better than all this like thesis-based bullshit that I'm trying to pull off. Like, that's the picture that like has life. So at that point I was like, okay, I'm gonna show that. And then I showed it. It wound up in Greater New York in 1999, and that was sort of like
I remember
the first moment where I had exhibited something that was not made for an artwork. You know, it was like made for another purpose. And then I realized like, okay, so this is like appropriation, but it's of my own thing. And I was noticing that looking back through your book, you include mistakes, like things that aren't perfect, things that are off in a way, and like these are all qualities that I think we share. Well,
first of all, I have no photographic education. I did go to school, I take classes when I lived in Sun Valley, Idaho, and that was it. Then I left there, and then I was on my own. The thing I realized I knew is I knew what I wanted to take. I just needed to know how to get there. And I did it by trial and error. And I've used the same camera and the same lens probably for 40 years. And I think that's a great lesson for all the photographers in the world who have 50 million pieces of gear, that it's not the camera that does it.